Welcome to this week's edition of Done and Dusted. I'm Counsel, accredited family law specialist, and your host for this evening. I'm joined by my fellow podcaster, Darren Mort. Darren is a family law barrister, film producer, and like me, a strong voice in the family violence space. Joining us tonight is our very special guest, Dr. Sue Packer, and she's going to talk about how a paediatrician navigates her way through childhood trauma, in particular, with her clients being children. So she's our guest tonight on Done and Dusted, and her career has so many highlights. I don't think I'm going to have time. Otherwise, our half hour will go simply by talking about what Sue's accomplished in her life. But briefly, in 1999, Dr. Packer was awarded an Order of Australia for services to Paediatrics Child Protection in the community. And in 2021, this was upgraded to an AO for advocacy for children. In 2013, the Canberra Centenary, she was awarded ACT Citizen of the Year, and on 25 January 2019, she was chosen to be 2019 Senior Australian of the Year. Dr. Sue continues to work on boards and charities, frequently asked to participate in child-focused health and education initiatives. Welcome, Dr. Sue. I'm using the term that your children, the children you see call you. So if we can start with that. In fact, that's probably a very good place to start. And that is, how is it that a child who's suffered trauma may come to sit in front of a paediatrician? How do people get referred to paediatricians and why?
Well, I think one of the sad things is most of the children are not referred predominantly for trauma. I had a special position in a child protection unit, so I did see children who were acutely abused and neglected. Most paediatricians have children referred for long-term behavioural issues and developmental issues, and unfortunately, many of them still do not think of trauma as a cause of these problems for which they're seeing the children. I also found that even the children I'd seen acutely traumatised would generally go to a general paediatrician for follow-up, and I was frequently concerned by their lack of appreciation of the continuing impact of the trauma on those children's lives. It's something we don't like to think about as people, and I don't think paediatricians like to think about it anymore, and they really do need to be reminded.
So is it part of a paediatrician's training to get at the underlying cause, which might be trauma, but it's evidenced in a variety of symptoms, if that makes sense?
But the scary thing is, when I did paediatrics, child abuse wasn't mentioned.
Mm.
It's a relatively recent thing. In the 19, it was recognised, was thought to be individuals who were nasty people who hurt children. And then the same happened with sexual abuse in the 1980s, and more recently with more attention paid to family violence and the fact this impacts on children. Again, the children aren't thought about in these contexts. We'd much rather think about a few nasty people being nasty to children than thinking about it more as a society problem. And this remains an issue, yeah. And
also being so close to home if it's family violence. That's a space that Darren and I work in, obviously, yes. And that's the impact of parental violence and the fallout on children. So, Darren, this is something that prompted you, for example, to produce a film called Tommy. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. I think I've said it many times before. I saw a lot of measures being taken when it's too late, and I think producing a film was important for me in terms of a tool that could be used as a preventative measure to stop people like Tommy visiting people like you, Sue, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it never ceases to amaze me, Sue, how training and what I consider to be basic training gets left off the agenda. For family lawyers, for example, there is no obligation on us to have any training in relation to family violence or the impact on children. So if we're talking about family violence presenting a serious risk and creating serious trauma, emotional trauma for very young children, what's the impact from your perspective, Dr. Sue, on those children?
I think this was my biggest learning when I started my work way back around about 1989, 90, when I started doing a lot of child protection work. And I think I mentioned it when I was Senior Australian of the Year, but probably one of the most shattering moments, excuse me, of my career was being called to see a very young baby, only about 8 weeks old. Excuse me, I'll have a drink. And this baby was one of the most traumatised babies I've ever seen, with multiple fractures, ruptured bowel. It is astounding this baby survived, and as one might expect, there was massive family violence. So around about 1990, nobody did anything about that. And the baby, against all expectations, survived. And a few weeks later, I was in the nursery checking on the progress. And I started to speak, not as loudly as I'm speaking now, standing next to this baby, and watch this child freeze, become so still that you could scarcely detect that this child was alive, and to realise suddenly that a baby as young as this could be as aware as this baby was of their environment, and the only means of protection was to not be noticed. And having become aware of that, I then saw it more and more frequently, even in very young babies. One of the ways they call it is frozen watchfulness. And it's babies who have been sufficiently hurt by being alive that they look at the world to try and assess if it's safe or not, and be still to not notice it. And the sad thing is, particularly child protection workers are likely to see these as good children. Because they don't cry, they don't pretend. They're beyond that. They're the most traumatised children, and it tends always to be overlooked. I remember with this particular child, at one disastrous stage, a grandmother was involved and marched this child in a stroller to her lawyer to say, look, the child is fine with me. And all I could see was this absolutely frozen child. And this child is now an adult, and dissociation is probably still the biggest problem in a person's life.
Wow.
So it's ripples in ponds. People assume if you remove a child from the immediate impact that's caused trauma, the child will eventually be okay once you make the child safe. But that's not the case, is it, Dr. Sue?
No. This child ended up, after the usual kerfuffle, in a very appropriate foster situation. But they're never normal, because you've always got stresses and court stuff and all the rest of it happening. But there is no doubt the best support for these children is a family where they are absolutely safe, feel absolute stability, but they're also, I think the words I say in this more than anything, a relationship. We are relational animals. And particularly for a badly traumatised child, they have to grow up in an environment where there is somebody who can love them unconditionally and be there for them, and learn to recognise their responses and help them with them.
So is that sense of I suppose almost learned behaviour, if you're exposed to trauma for an extended period of time, is that indelibly printed going forward in terms of your reactions, your behaviours? I mean, can that behaviour become unlearned?
I believe it can't be. I think some therapies now can reduce it, minimalise it, but I think there still will be situations where this will come to the fore. And particularly when you think that these things have happened long, long before any words have developed.
Mm,
This
yeah.
is in the fundamental development of the brain tracts, which are responding to the environment.
Yeah. So haven't they done, isn't there some recent studies in terms of the organic and inorganic impact on on a baby's brain, even listening to two parents arguing loudly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's been recognised for some time, and there have been very clear demonstrations that the baby is aware of and responds to the stuff even before they're born.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Even
this
before
is
they're
really
born, they can hear and respond to this. And then, I mean, it happens in lovely things too. One of the lovely examples is the good Australian soapy Neighbours used to be played in England at 4 in the afternoon. And all these overworked mums would sit down with a cup of tea and a biscuit and their feet up in their pregnancy and listen to watch Neighbours. And when these babies were born, they discovered that these babies calmed to the sound of Neighbours' music.
How's that?
So it can have its
the mother
pluses
was
and
calm.
minuses, but it certainly shows that these babies before birth hear and respond, and it's the hormonal response. The messages from their mum is that life is good and everything's calm and relaxed, and these messages come through every bit as strongly as the ones we want to avoid, which is that life is dangerous and what life is scary and the mums are scared. And yeah, so the good stories do make a lot of the work okay. Yeah.
It's really interesting because I became a Vedic meditator, transcendental meditator about 15 years ago, and I was basically introduced to the studies that they had done in relation to brain responses and the hardwiring of reaction to stressors. Somebody who wouldn't ordinarily be identified as being suffering from trauma at any age of their life. But by the time a human is 20, they might have 70,000 negative responses to various situations. So imagine make 35,000 of those 70,000 responses really negative. And I was going to ask the question, how do you go about treating? But you've already answered the imponderable, and that is not, you can't necessarily treat, you can manage, is what I'm hearing.
You can certainly do things which are extremely helpful, and you can certainly do things which perpetuate and make things worse.
Yeah.
And I think as a generalization, if you get a baby early in the first year of life and early on in the course of trauma and provide love and stability from them, the children have the best chance of as normal development as possible. But there can be no guarantees because we don't know what's happened to these children. And I've certainly seen children removed from concerning but not appalling environments, and certainly with violence always part of it, and been in remarkably stable placements, which again doesn't always happen. These children still have very different responses, very distressing responses, particularly to a change in routine. These are the kids at school who can't cope with a replacement teacher. They can't cope with a change in what's the predicted routine. And one I can think of with a little boy that was in a fantastic foster placement. He went to a very nice school, and when he got distressed, his teacher had worked out the best thing to do was to send him off for a little bit of quiet time with the principal. So he'd say, here's a letter for the principal, can you take it to him? So he'd go in and the letter would say he needs a cup of tea. And that'd mean they sat down together and had a little chat till he calmed down. And that worked very well. But then this was only a school, an infant school. He moved to a big primary school. He got distressed by something unexpected. And the teachers, the principal's interpretation there was that he was running off, therefore he couldn't go to the much anticipated special excursion and many other things. And the foster mum said, look, he wasn't running away, he was running to find his cup of tea. And this bewildered response saying, but there are bubblers in the playground. You know, this real difficulty grasping that this child needed different treatment. I will say this principal in the end did get it and became wildly over enthusiastic almost about it. But it's the fact that these children do need sensitive people who, well, all kids need at times, you know, that certain situations are likely to distress and heighten them. And you anticipate these as they're grown up in their lives and do your best to damp them down a bit in whichever way is most appropriate. And you can help.
So,
yeah.
So Sue, Darren and I often talk about differentiation in a sibling group, don't we, Darren?
Yep.
And I'm wondering how that might play out, whether in a sibling group, whether children experience, I think I know the answer to this, and I think Darren does as well. Do children experience trauma to the in the same way, to the same degree, and therefore is there a cookie cutter response in relation to
Look, there are several things here.
treatment?
Equally, each child has a different position in the family. They're seen differently. They can have been seen differently from the time of their birth. They can be treated differently by each parent. In fact, it's often part of the family dysfunction and violence that different parents have favourite children and treat children differently. So, like all these things, there are so many factors that play a part. And I think nothing gets past spending a very long time getting a detailed history and then being prepared to modify this as you learn more and more stuff. I think I mentioned in a letter to you, Caroline, that when I was about 2, I think, there was a major catastrophe in the family, which resulted in my 9-month-old sister and I going into childcare for 2 weeks while my mother sorted her life out. Now, the only way I heard of this, and I'd never heard of it as trauma, was my mother repeatedly telling us how wonderful this GP was, who basically enabled her to sort her life out. We always took for granted and knew that my 9-month-old sister came out of this profoundly traumatized and also physically ill with gastro. Now, she had been fully breastfed. She was abruptly weaned, put in this children's home for 2 weeks with no contact with my mother, and then came home. And it has changed the rest of the course of her life. She was brilliant. She was witty. She was intelligent, but she had enormous problems in many different situations. And then not too long ago, I started wondering, well, how it had impacted on me. And I thought, goodness knows, I couldn't quite work it out. But I now worked out that I managed most of these trauma situations in the course of my working life and probably my private life too, by dissociating. So it's the same dissociation that small children tend to indulge in, which can actually also be useful because you can lift yourself away from the situation and assess it. And I find in the course of my everyday trauma work, this is a very useful trait, skill, consequence, whatever you like to call it. And I think you have to look at these things, that the trauma impacts on every child in a different way. It's
about survival.
Yeah.
It's really about survival, but it's going to manifest. To sum up, what you're saying is it might manifest differently for different children.
The same way the children who are sexually abused, I could almost say at the outset, if you had a child from a secure family where the child was dearly loved, where maybe the abuse had happened with a neighbour or somebody trusted outside the family, and you knew the fundamental family structure was focused on that child, was secure for that child, would not be without consequences, but these would be about as well managed as they could be. The far more common situation of a child growing up in chaos nothing about the system works for those children. Begin with, they'd never get to court because they couldn't give a clear account of what had happened, because so many things had happened. And they tended not to have the stability in their lives.
So Darren, you'd also see this in your independent children's work in the family courts, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you speak, Sue, I'm just thinking, I not only see it in my work in the court, but I see it as an actor, would you believe? Because
I see court as acting, that's all right.
yeah, well, it's probably the same thing. It's probably not all of us, but some of us have experienced trauma to one degree or the other. I know I have as a child growing up. And I think sometimes some personalities expose themselves to that trauma. Expose themselves to repeated trauma or trauma of some variety. For example, if you're an actor playing a character that's been traumatized, by exposing yourself to that character and reliving that trauma, it's sending messages to yourself that it's okay, you're safe, you've got through that, you're exposed to that character. And I think sometimes as family lawyers, we do that quite oddly too. You said before, Sue, in your practice as a paediatrician.
Yeah.
And sometimes you come face to face with your own triggers. Your occupation, whatever that is, assists you in overcoming those feelings of insecurity or anxiety, whatever they might be. So I think trauma is a really interesting thing. I mean, who'd be a family lawyer like us, honestly? We're exposed to trauma every day. And significant trauma like you, and you're describing that baby before, terrible. And it's odd and it's not cookie cutter stuff. And it's very personal and hard for people to understand, let alone judges who not all the time are trained in trauma and don't understand the nuances. I mean, I don't understand the nuances. It's a big swimming pool as far as I'm concerned. But you were saying before, Sue, and I thought it was interesting that, you know, that little boy who was the cup of tea that was running towards a cup of tea. I just thought we can't bring up our kids in cotton wool balls.
No.
And they're exposed to a really harsh life on the playground, with bullies and, feelings of inadequacy, all sorts of things are going on. And I remember in my days at school, we had 3 kids who came from separated homes, and I didn't find out about that till we finished school because it wasn't spoken about. But those kids must have gone through a lot of trauma. At least these days, that trauma is a lot more addressed than what it used to be.
I'm not sure that it is.
Right. Why do you say that?
A lot of dealings with schools. To begin with, even in the structure of the school day, children these days, for organisation reasons, as opposed to turn up at school virtually to go straight into the classroom to begin work. Schools seldom provide supervision for more than 15, 20 minutes before the start of the school day. Before that, the parents are responsible. At least when you think if there was ongoing stress and distress at home, half an hour running around with your mates in the playground before you go inside could calm many children down. Now they're going straight with their head all over the place into a classroom and be expected to settle to work. We don't do this ourselves at work. You tend to go in, make a cup of coffee, say, did you see that stuff on television last night? You just spend 10, 15 minutes going from world 1 to world 2. We don't give children this luxury. All the emphasis increasingly, and particularly in infant school, was on a far more structured school day and learning outcomes. My 6-year-old grandson said we only get to play twice.
Wow.
It's a big worry, and the kids are not as well known. Children are now, the ACT, enrolled at school online. Principal doesn't even necessarily meet the family. So you've got this child coming in as an unknown quantity from an unknown background. You might know the parents are separated.
Mm.
You don't know anything, whether it's basically fairly civilized or totally uncivilized.
And it really must mess with a kid's mind when they've got this suffering, this trauma at home, which isn't spoken about.
Yeah.
And mum and dad bring that very child from world 1 into world 2, being their school, their safe and secure place, sitting down with them at parent-teacher meetings. The things that must be going through that little kid's head must be extraordinary.
Yeah.
And Sarah, one of the questions, and this is a fantastic segue, Darren, is that how many kids out there are undiagnosed and therefore untreated, and how that must play out. You know, you've mentioned your own sister. Literally, how does that play out?
Yeah.
Through early childhood, through childhood puberty, and then into adult life. How do those ripples in the pond affect that person?
So often it's seen as the child and the child's problem.
Oh yeah, like that kid's a real, you know, dare I say it, that kid's real shit. That kid's a real little shit.
Yeah.
And it might just be that child is a victim of trauma, not identified, not treated.
Yeah.
There must be many kids out there that fall through the gap.
Yeah. And if you're seen as the bad child at home, the difficult child, the obstructive child at home, you come to school with that label. You're likely to play in a way which reinforces that label. Certainly see that with a lot of children. In fact, these are the group that on a whole tend to go on to adults with mental health and criminal problems as well, and drug problems, because they've been seen all along as different and a problem.
There's no hope for these kids, is there, when they're trying to develop their own relationships?
Well, they can be if it's recognised, yes.
Yeah, it's it's not a good way to start a race, is it?
No, it is not at all. And I mean, even I spent a lot of time finding schools for these kids which were more likely to be supportive. But then when you've got school policies that the principals have to move on every 5 years, so you get up something beautifully established, then somebody else moves in, puts their stamp on the school, which is totally different. And this child goes from being well accommodated to an absolute sort of giving up. And this impact is not really considered. It is very much run for the system. The children are supposed to conform to appropriate forms of therapy. I mean, like here, there was a program which was very trauma focused, and the first thing they discovered was that they had to do a lot of work with the teachers first to get the teachers to recognise their own trigger points and weaknesses, so they're in a better position to recognise and support the kids.
Yeah.
But then if the directorate doesn't want to fund that program, we're now left with a program which I have enormous concerns about, that it works well enough if you come from a regular, stable home, but children who've not had that are more likely to see themselves as a problem.
Yeah.
And if you've got systems that don't support the teachers to support the kids, it's all very tricky. And I think a lot of it in Australia comes down, I guess it's where valuing children comes in, that the children are not seen as full citizens in their own right.
Yeah.
A good child is not a noticeable child unless they're noticed.
And
brilliant, so the teachers feel it's them and the parents.
Good point.
Yeah, we've had this very interesting series of conversations about how many children are empowered and then disempowered, and that whole, we'll listen to you on certain topics, but there are others we're not going to listen.
Yes.
We're going to take away your own advocacy. We'll dictate outcomes for you. And we see that particularly in family law, where we practice, we muzzle the child. We want to filter who the child is and what the child wants, as opposed to really taking the cue. What does this child need?
Yeah.
How do you ascertain what does this child need? Dr. Sue, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I was going to open up another Pandora's box about intergenerational trauma and how that plays out across multiple generations. But unfortunately, I think we've come to the end of our episode of Done and Dusted.
Already.
I'm just
Can you
having
believe
fun.
it?
Yeah.
So we are definitely, I'm committing you, Sue, to come back and speak to us further, because I think this is not just not undiagnosed in schools and amongst doctors and some pediatricians, obviously, but in our work, we have no yardstick and we have no training. So, and we are touching very raw nerves in families, and we're not trained how to identify. We're not trained how to refer on. We're not trained how to manage it. So thank you so much, Dr. Sue, for coming on this episode of Done and Dusted. Thank you, Darren, my fellow podcaster. Always insightful and always a delight to hear your input.